That's okay.
Well then done in
Have you started the other one? What's going on? Hang out on there. It's not saying we're live, is it? Just unplug that and tick it. Hi there everyone, as we say in Bulgaria, Dobro Utro, or is it Dobar Den now? It's just gone 12 o'clock our time, and I guess it's 10 o'clock, so this is my first live stream, and Sarah and I are both really nervous. So welcome to the Whiteboat Studio. We're not actually at the studio, we're at home, which is a small village just near Sozopol. And the reason we're here is because the internet's better. You may get some occasional country noises like chickens or chainsaws or things like that, but we'll give it a go anyway. So welcome everybody. I don't know if anybody's joined us yet, but this is, if I could introduce Sarah. This is Sarah. Say hello, Sarah.
Hi.
And Sarah's going to be handling the chat for me because I'm going to be busy doing this demonstration today on watercolour painting for beginners, and this was suggested by Pat Kelly, who does amazing animal portraits, and I think she's from the Isle of Man, so I don't know if Pat's joining us today. I'm sure Sarah will keep me up to date. So this is the painting that we're going to be doing, which is called Eftim the Fisherman, and every morning outside the studio I get up early to have a coffee, and Eftim goes out. He owns the restaurant next door and he goes out fishing, and I originally did this as an acrylic painting which he bought before the paint was dry, and in fact I think he bought 2 that day. So this was the sketch that you may have seen online. So if you're going to paint along, I'll just run through the materials. This is also the sketch, but this is done on Bockingford watercolour paper. Today we're going to be using Tintoretto paints, which are these. Happen to have a full range of these. I'm not going to dwell too much on the colour names because I know these are not common to some of the brands that you can buy, for instance in the States or in the UK. So if you're joining us live, that would be great, but if you're watching this as a repeat on my YouTube channel, I hope you enjoy it. I'll just run through the materials that we're going to use. Let me move that one out of the way. I'll just run through the materials that we use. I'm using tubes of Tintoretto today, and you can use either tubes or pans, and you can use a palette, or as I'm doing, I'm going to use dishes. Now, the reason that I use dishes, particularly for beginners, is that if you mix together 3 primary colours, which are red, yellow and blue, you end up with browns. And one of the biggest problems that beginners face is avoiding a muddy looking painting. So by only mixing a couple of colours together in these dishes, it helps you avoid those compound colours, which I love, and I know other artists love them.
Matt's joined you, by the way.
Who?
Matt.
Matt. Welcome, Matt. I'm not going to be able to show your painting today because we've been battling with technology, but welcome from Grimsby, I think, aren't you, Matt?
And Pat Kelly's here as well.
Hi, Pat. This is for you. We're doing Boats and Reflections, so welcome. It's Isle of Man, I think it is, isn't it, Pat?
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm going to use just a few brushes. I've got a couple of flat brushes here, and I've wet them first, which I always do because it helps to soak up the paint and helps when you're mixing. So we've got a rigger, a couple of round brushes and a couple of flat brushes. I've got lots more brushes in case I need them. In addition to that, I've got some colours squeezed out into my dishes. This is a dish that I use for greens. There's gamboge, ultramarine and a couple of tube greens in there which I really don't like using, but for the purposes of this demo it'll do perfectly fine. Another one is my sky dishes. So it's got a few blues in there. Ultramarine, which is a blue that I used to use for skies in England, but it didn't really work when I was teaching in Asia or in Bulgaria or in Greece where I teach. And there's some pink in there too. So there's cerulean blue, cobalt blue and ultramarine from right to left, and then there's some pinky colour in there. I always like to warm my skies up a bit. And then this one is for Eftim's jacket, and it's also a dish that I use for flowers. I've just set these up this morning, that's why they're so clean. And then I've got another dish here which I use for neutrals. Can you see that alright on camera, Sarah? Is it coming out?
T. Jones online.
Who?
T. Jones.
Hi, where are you from? T. Jones? And this is a dish that I use for neutrals. There's one of my favourite colours in here, which is this one, which is Caput Mortem. And then another colour that I like to use is ultramarine and burnt umber, which is also in there. So we'll be using some of those today. So the first thing that I do when I paint is to prepare the colours. The brushes are all prepared and I usually dry them in a dish in a sloping down direction, and then the paint doesn't fall off the handles as they tend to do, particularly with cheaper brushes. So the first thing I'm going to do is to mix the colour for the sky. I usually paint front to back and light to dark. Can you see that in the frame, Sarah? Is that alright?
Yeah.
Okay. So this is the dish that I'm going to use. These were new tubes today and I had to mop up some gum arabic that came out of the tubes. Obviously they're brand new, so you may have to do that as well. So the first thing I do is to spray. I've already pre-wet my brushes and I've also dried them out a little bit, but there's still a little bit of dampness in these and that's what you need.
We've got someone from Lexington, America.
Really?
That must be really early.
Oh, really late. Welcome anyway, whoever you are.
No, Patty May. That's early.
Patty May. What time
Thanks
is
for waking up so early.
Did you set your alarm clock? So the first thing I'm going to do is to spray these with water, and I'm going to leave the ultramarine for now. I may use that on the boat later, so I'm going to spray. I meant to start my lesson by saying "hey up" because I'm from Yorkshire. Anybody else from Yorkshire? So this is cobalt blue and this is blue, and we're just going to spray a little bit of that pink too. So this is just a normal water bottle. It used to be mosquito spray, or you can use one of these which is a garden sprayer. And I've also got a jug of clean water here and some kitchen rolls standing by. So the first thing I'm going to do, we're going to paint the sky wet into wet. And I know a lot of people are intimidated with skies. Let me just get some tissue, I know we're going to need it.
That's it.
How do? You alright, Matt? I love your book paintings, by the way, Matt. It makes me sick, he's so young and he's only been painting for about 4 months. I've been sketching for a lot of years. It's obvious that he has, but he's I think we're on a par now. I've been painting for years. That sounded a bit like what's that programme where they say is he local? Okay, so I've prepared my brush now. There's a couple of ways of doing that. There's the social way, which is to dip it right to the bottom of the pot. Oh, sorry, that made the camera shake, I think. And then just wipe it on the tissue, and that gets rid of all the residual water which may affect the colour if you brush up vertically. So there's a couple of ways. That's the sociable way. The anti-social way, particularly if somebody's watching you, is to actually just flick it on the floor. Sarah will hate me for doing that. And that's now ready to use with the paint. So first thing I'm going to do is prepare this blue, and I like to mix so I'm dipping into the water. And I'm just going to mix some cobalt blue, some cerulean blue and some of that pink in there. And it wants to have the consistency of milk. Now, if you live sophisticated like England, you'll probably say, well, there's lots of different types of milk. So we're looking for something about gold top. Now we can be quite strong with this colour because we're going to paint the sky wet into wet. It means that it's going to dilute this colour anyway, but watercolours always dry lighter, so I'm just going to check this colour on a piece of paper, and I think that's a little bit weak. You can check the consistency of the paint by just dragging it up the dish, and it's kind of holding together quite well, but I'm just going to mix a bit more cobalt blue into that to make it a little bit bluer. Yeah, that's a bit thicker now, so I'm happy with that. I'll put that to one side, and now we're going to do the sky wetting. I'm doing this stood up. Generally speaking, I paint stood up. Usually Sarah will vouch for me with real loud music on. But today there's no music. Might get the odd chainsaw.
Green's here.
Hi Tony, welcome.
Walking his dog, so he's a bit late.
How dare you? Welcome Tony. What kind of dog have you got? Right. So I'm dipping my brush into the water and then just taking off the surplus. And I'm left-handed, so when I paint wet into wet, I paint right to left, or when I paint right to left. Otherwise you end up smudging everything. Now there's a couple of ways of doing skies. You can either leave gaps with the water, or you can just wet the whole area, and it's probably easier if you're a complete beginner to wet the whole area. You avoid any hard edges as well. Now there's a thing in watercolour painting called the golden time, and if anybody of you have my ebook on page 7, you'll find that it figures quite a lot in a lot of my YouTube tutorials, and also in teaching when I'm doing painting holidays and workshops. And it's called the golden time, and you can see that the paper is buckling up a little bit. You might not be able to see it, but trust me, it is. This is 300 gram Bockingford rough paper, nice English paper. I'm painting quite carefully around these mountains. If your water is slightly tinted, it actually helps you to see where you've put the water. So anything that's dark you can paint over. Anything where you want to retain the light, masts for instance, if those were going to be white, I'd be painting around those. So can you see the reflection on that, Sarah, from there? Okay, the golden time is the amount of time that you've got in your location when you can manipulate paint, you can add colours to it, you can do some lifting off. But once the shine starts to go off the paper, you should really stop.
It's just buffing a little bit. Sounds good, but it's just buffing.
Okay, I'm not sure we've got... Oh, shall I open that door?
Yeah, maybe.
We might. The rack is in the other room. How is it? Is that better? I don't know if internet signals go through doors, do they? Anyway.
We'll try it.
We digress, excuse me. Now, because I usually paint in hot countries, that golden time when the shine goes off the paper is a matter of minutes, and you can see where I started. I don't know if you can pick it up on the camera there, Sarah, but you can see from here, because I'm painting against a window, that this side of the painting where I started is starting to dry. Now if I was to continue working on that, I'd end up with a dirty and muddy looking painting, so it's best to actually re-wet it, and I'm only going to re-wet about the first third of this. Also try and avoid any gaps around the border, because when you use this, is just stuck down with masking tape and it leaves a nice border around the painting. I get my frames and my mounts made to standard sizes as well, so I know that every painting will go in, and hopefully I don't need to swap them and they'll just sell, but you never know. Can you see that, Sarah? Okay, this buckling up is caused by wetting of the paper. This paper that I've done the test strip on is actually Hannenmühle paper, German paper, and it's lovely to work on if you want to get right back to whites. It's slightly rougher on one side than the other side, but this is Bockingford paper, and because I live in a very unsophisticated country, I know that I can get Bockingford paper all the time, and I usually buy it in packs of 25 and sure that no one else has touched it. after the mill that made it. That from me. So if you have puddles, you can just wipe them off the painting, and it's also quite prudent to wipe around the border both with water and with paint to stop that bleeding back in. The paper as it dries is going to go flat. Under normal circumstances, to get recession in paintings, I usually start with the lightest colour and then wood and make the colours warmer as I move into the foreground. And obviously if I want a hard edge on these mountains, then I need to make sure that the sky's dry before I actually paint those mountains. Now under normal circumstances I would do that with a hairdryer, but I know I've seen tutorials where they've used a hairdryer and it's a bit distracting. So now I'm going to paint the sky, so let's go for a nice summery sky with some clouds. If everybody could let me know if the lighting's good, if it's smooth for you to see, if the picture quality is good as well, that would help me. This is our first live stream, so it's a bit of a steep learning curve. Can you see the top of that sky, Sarah? Yeah. Okay, so I'm starting just where I went before, and I'm kind of tickling the sky. It's always a good idea to leave one or two edges of white just before the edge, otherwise you end up with like a halo. I'm dipping into the paint without wetting it. And I'm trying to vary the sky colour from one side. See repetition, so I don't know if you just saw me just cover this area up. It looked exactly like that, and the human brain is great at forcing you to repeat things, and it's nothing looks worse in a natural watercolour. And as it gets to the horizon, it usually gets lighter. So the sky above you is usually darker than the sky in the distance. So now I'm not dipping into the paint anymore, trying to avoid a pattern. There's a puddle there of dark paint. I'm just going to sweep that off the painting. Now it's starting to dry here, so I'm going to have to work quite quickly, otherwise I'll end up with hard edges. So now, and this is the secret bit, I'm going to wash my brush right to the bottom of the pot, and I want this to be lighter, so I'm going to dilute this on the paper. But if I just use that brush without wiping it on my tissue, I'll end up with a hard edge mark called a cauliflower or a backroom. So I'm just going to make sure that that brush is just slightly moist and no more. And then if you want movement, you can just tip your board. So let's say that Eftim's going out and there's a risk of a storm. So let's just tip the board and see what happens. And you can see, I don't know if you can see that, Sarah, is that focusing okay?
Yeah, just go slightly
slightly down. Okay. So if you hold your board just on one angle, you'll find that you end up with effects of rain. You can see it kind of happening there. And then when you're happy with the result, just sit it flat. At this stage, you'll end up with a bead, which can either be your friend or it can be your enemy. I don't know if you can see it running around on the bottom of these mountains here. So once I'm happy with the result of that, I sit the board down. Now's the time to actually just delicately go around these mountains if you've missed anything. There is a way of actually lifting that off later when that sky's dry. And I don't know if you can see down here, down this edge, there's a bit of a line forming there. So all I do is sweep kind of semi-dry brush into that to make sure that doesn't cause a cauliflower. And then for this stage, I'll just around the border. Again, what will happen is as this paper dries flat, you'll end up with a hard line around the painting if you don't remove this. You can do this either with a brush that's moistened or with a piece of tissue. And that's the sky done. Couldn't be simpler. I like to complete my skies in one hit if I can. I'm just gonna, there's a bit of a line forming there, so I'm just gonna take my brush, which I've washed right to the bottom of the pot, which you can probably hear, and wipe it on my tissue, and you can lift out some clouds. So if this line is a bit offensive, and I find it is, just tickle the brush into this area and break that up. I know that there's art clubs will teach you how to do clouds with both a brush and with kitchen roll or toilet roll. If you do it with kitchen roll, maybe I should demonstrate it. You get a hard edge mark like this, and if you do it with a brush, you get a soft edge mark like this one down here, and the combination actually works quite well. Just get rid of that line again. Both Sarah and I have been really nervous about doing this, and I think I've painted this about 100 times in my sleep. Bear with us.
It's still buffering a little bit on some people's computer. Not everybody is.
You'll find that if you've got buffering, if you just refresh the page, so I read that on YouTube, I think. Apparently if you refresh the page, you may find that it'll stop that. We're on quite a good internet here in Bulgaria, so I doubt it's ours, and I know there's 4 bars I think on there today, Sarah, so it's pretty good. We've got quite fast internet. When you're choosing the brushes, just choose a brush size that you're comfortable with. The size that I'm painting today is 1/8 sheet, which is well, on Bockingford paper. Is that imperial or is it metric? I can't remember, but it's oh, it must be imperial. So it's 11.5 by 7.5. And I always tear my paper. You may have seen my funny video about how to tear watercolour paper. These brushes are lovely. They're a Skoda Perla brushes by Joseph Ludwig. I know Matt's a big fan of Joseph's. I can see it in your work, mate. Okay, now under normal circumstances I wouldn't paint this edge if I wanted a hard edge mark on here, but I don't want to use a hairdryer today, so I probably will. Now I've been stood up to do that area of the sky. I'll tell you what, I'll give it a bit more time to dry. So if the normal order that I would paint in is the sky first, the distant hills next, the nearer hills next, this here, and then probably the boat and the sea. That's normally the order that I would paint in. But because I want this to dry, so I can get a hard edge mark on the top of the hills there, I'm going to concentrate on the water area. And I know Matt was seeing how these highlights were done, so I'll show you. It's one of my favourite things to paint. We live by the sea, and boats and reflections is something I see every day. So just a quick one here. If you're painting a complicated subject, I always put an arrow in the corner of my painting and also in my sketches, because it reminds me of which direction the sun is coming from. You can also decide that once you've done your sky, but I flipped the board this way so it indicated that the light was coming from the right anyway. Okay, so let's do the water. Under normal circumstances I paint stood up for the big things, and then I sit down for the small items in the painting. And the reason that I do it particularly when I'm painting water is it's really easy to sit your hand. We were taught to write like this at school, to sit your hand on the heel of your hand, and if you're painting water, can you see that in the frame all right? If you're painting water, you tend to get water that goes up in the middle and down at the sides. So what I like to do is actually use a big rocking motion with my whole arm to make sure that those lines remain horizontal. So we can either paint water wet into wet, or we can paint it wet on dry. And because it's quite warm today, I'm going to paint that wet in wet. So the light's coming from the right hand side, so this side of the boat would be highlighted, and also the sides of these hills, the shoulder and the head of the fisherman, they would also be highlighted too. Excuse me, I'll just get a drink. It's not a cup of tea like some artists have. Okay, so I'm with the paintbrush again and just taking the surplus out of it. Now I want to paint quite delicately around this boat, so I'm going to use, there's usually a white line underneath an area of land as well, a highlight, so I'm going to leave just a little gap just here and also here. And now I'm going to paint big broad sweeps. So I'm turning this is about 1 1/4 inch, 1.5 flat brush. And if it runs out of water, I'm quite happy for that, because that's what gives sparkle to water. So I'm just running this flat brush all the way along the underneath of the boat, and can you see you can get a really accurate horizontal line. I don't want much paint on this because I'd like some dry brush, so we'll end up with sparkle there. And I'll go up to this and just leave a little gap again. I'm going to do exactly the same with the paint. So I've gone into the same paint as I've used in the sky, and it's wet into wet, so it'll end up about the same tone. I always think it's nice if you reflect the sky colour in the water, and I'm just going to run this along, and I'm going to get some dry brush. That's nice. I'm going to leave that area just there. I'll take it right to the bottom. Okay, so this side of the boat, I'm going to switch to a slightly smaller flat brush.
Just a question.
Yeah.
What make of paints are you using?
Tintoretto. And the reason I don't mention the colours is that I know that they're not available everywhere.
What's equivalent to Caput Morto? I'm sorry.
It's vermilion and if you mix vermilion and ultramarine blue. Right, I just need to get on with this before it dries. I'm happy to answer questions, by the way, but this is quite an important bit. So the reflection of this boat's going to be here. So I'm just taking this and dragging this off. Now you've got to keep washing your brush out and doing this, because it has a tendency to bleed back in. I don't know if you can see that. You can also do this with a sponge. But the important thing with reflections is to make sure that they're always vertical. I'm going to soften this edge a little bit just here and just there. This is going to be a warts and all demonstration, is this one. It was always going to be. May switch to my bigger brush now. You can see it's bleeding back in here. I also have a puddle just here, so I'm just going to lift that out. And again, if you just drag that along, it looks like distant waves. I know that Matt's great at doing his dark waves. I like my water to be calm. So if the water's calm, you get a perfect reflection, and if it's not, you don't. So I'm just keep dragging this, but I'm conscious that every time I do that, it's drying this paper. And the next thing I'm going to do is ground this boat, which is a little tip that I use. So just wipe this border around, stop this bleeding back in. By the way, these demos should be about an hour, but who knows, it's the first one. I always try and simplify the subjects. So I'm going to mix some Caput Mortuum. Sorry, was there any more questions about that, Sarah? Was that just about Caput Mortuum?
Yeah, it's about Caput Mortuum.
Okay.
UK.
Yeah, I saw a really interesting story. It's, I think it's ground up bones of some animal or something is Caput Mortuum. So I'm going to mix this quite thickly. The reason for that is that if you add a paint, you can see that, if you add a paint to another paint and it's thinner, you'll get a cauliflower or a watermark. So this is a tip that I used when something's sitting on something else. Just make sure I don't pick up any pure pigment, which I had, and then while this is still wet, I'm just going to add horizontal line on the bottom of this boat, and that's what makes it sit in the water. Just wet my brush slightly, and there would also be a shadow being cast on the water just there, but I may have some highlights there because of the way that the boat's moving along in the water. And that's it for the water area. So now I'm going to sit down. Any more questions? Anybody else joined us? The first test that we did of these, we didn't announce it, we just went live just to see how everything worked. And there was one lady joined us. What was her name? Can you remember? Okay.
That's Australia.
Was she from Australia?
Yeah.
She was there on her own, so we were just chatting to her. It was quite funny. So now I'm going to sit down and I'm just going to paint a dark line underneath this land area. Just here. But I'm going to leave a little gap. And if you want hard edges, you paint wet on dry, and if you want soft edges, you just soften them with water. I'm trying to make that as horizontal as I can. And this one looks quite hard, so I'm just going to wash this rigger brush out, and I'm just going to moisten the bottom of that so it bleeds. And this is the way I do waves as well.
Matt said he's learnt 2 things already.
Which are they, Matt? Pray tell, you can teach me how to paint water like you paint it, mate. What was it in particular, Matt? Okay, right. I should let that dry, but I'm actually going to make a start on these mountains. To get distance in your paintings, it's always apparent that if you look on the horizon, a hill that you know is covered in trees is actually a bluey colour, and so I tend to use, if I was doing distant hills, say here, I would maybe make this bluer, and then as I move to the nearer hills I would add some green to it. So that's what we're going to do. But I also want to do some lifting off on these mountains because the light's coming from the right, so that the way that I do this is this. Just need to test the tone of this, because if I go too dark too soon it leaves you with nowhere to go, and you can see that that's way too dark for the distant hills. So
Matt's learnt about reflections, working with dry brush and towel on sky.
You don't need me to tell you about dry brush, Matt. You're great at it. And I know Matt's paintings are starting to look like Alvaro Castanet. He uses dry brush a lot, and so does Joseph Zbudvik. So this is Caput Mortem, and I want this to be quite weak, and you can see the tone of that, I think. One of the nicest lessons I teach when I do a workshop is how to paint in just one colour, and there's a YouTube tutorial about it. So I want this to be quite light in the distance here, so I'm going to paint this wet on wet, and if this sky is still damp it may bleed up into it. So I'm painting basically in line with the contours of this mountain. May end up with a cauliflower just there because there's too much water on the brush. So now into the Caput Mortem, and I'm just going to add this and try and get a hard edge on the top. If it does end up bleeding into the sky, it's no big deal because it looks like mist.
Matt says watching the paint helps him.
I wish it helped me, Matt. That's nice to say, thanks. If you want to paint mist, then all you need to do is, let's say this area of the bottom of this hill was misty. I've just washed my brush out and then just dried it on the tissue, and then just give yourself a horizontal line there. It also helps if you tip your board upside down and just let that added water just go up into that colour. And I'm wiping this surplus. Is that okay in frame,
Yeah.
Sarah? Yeah. I'm just wiping this surplus paint off here. And now I want to indicate that the sun's hitting this distant hill on the right hand side. So I'm taking a big brush, and a sideways sweep usually works. I'm going to try not to smudge my painting down here. I couldn't get a job as a draftsman when I left school because they said I'd always smudge my work. So I tend to work from right to left. If you're right-handed, which is most of the world, then you'd paint the opposite way around. So if you're doing the sky, you'd probably start up here and work your way to the right-hand side. So now, just with a soft brush, I'm just going to soften that bottom edge. And now, highlights, dip right to the bottom of the pot. If I hear this sound on other tutorials, I know that I'm not washing the brush out properly. So you need a clean brush to do this. So what I do is take a tissue, Wipe all the surplus off the ferrule of the brush, because if you don't it can drop in there and cause a cauliflower, and then just give it a squeeze. Try not to pull the hairs out of your good brushes, and then lift off on this side of the hill, and you'll find that if you use a sideways sweep of the brush you end up with a random shape. If you try and use the tip of the brush then you don't. So I'm just going to add some contours to this hill on this side just by removing some paint. Now if I wanted a hard edge here, so if this area of land was say rock covered, I would leave this to dry before I painted this, but these hills are actually tree covered, so I'm quite happy for that to bleed in with a soft edge. So now I'm going to mix my caput mortuum a little bit stronger, and then I'm going to do exactly the same with this hill. I'm being very careful around. Matt, I'm sure you'll tell me that I've got the shape of this hat wrong for this fisherman. It's supposed to be a hood of a sou'wester. It's actually captain's hat he wears, isn't it, Sarah? So I'll take that back off. Matt will love this one. I've got to be very careful, haven't I, Matt, about lining up his shoes. Because if for instance, this mast, if this mast were to agree with this hillside, then your eye would be drawn to it. So I'm painting as carefully as I can around his hat. I'll come back to that in a bit. And again, I probably wouldn't line this up with his shoulder for the same reason, or where his shoulder meets his head. I think I took Matt to task about that with one of his recent
Always tell him off.
I know, it's like having a teacher in the room, isn't it? Okay, and then I want to soften this bottom edge again, so I've just moistened my brush and I'm just going to soften this so it looks again. It's early morning, don't forget, so there might be some mist coming up from this mountain. And again, wash my brush out right to the bottom, squeeze it on my tissue, and I want some highlights off this hill. It's even possible, Matt, I don't mean to just aim this lesson at you, mate, but it's even possible to have a lining up issue at this stage, because if I were to drag this shape down and it met the top of his head, that would also be one. So you can't ever, so I'm avoiding that. So you can just see that the top of that hill now has got a bit of a highlight. Sometimes you need to do this 2 or 3 times. So everything that's fainted, that's facing the sun, might have a highlight on it. So we'll assume there might be a ridge coming down here. So we're now getting rid of the painting. This hill, because it's painted lighter, looks further away than here. I'm just going to use my rigger brush just to paint right into this little corner around Ephraim's head. And now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to soften that edge, and I want that to dry. So let's, that edge looks a little bit unnatural now, so I'm taking a flat brush, squeeze all the paint out of it, and I want this to be a little bit straighter, but slightly moist brush, and then you end up with a kind of soft edge which looks like distant trees. So if you like, we're reverse painting around those trees. And now I want to let that dry, because this edge of this mountain here, because I painted it when this one was wet, kind of blends into it, but I want this one to be very definite. Everything in this painting, the whole point of the painting is actually this guy in his boat in the early morning, and so all the lead-ins like the reflections, the mast, the mountains are all leading to Ephraim, and this will be quite a cool painting with a little bit of hot to it. And I know that that's something, I think I got that tip from John Lovett, a really nice mixed media artist from Australia. So paintings can either be a lot of cool with a little bit of warm, or a lot of warm with a little bit of cool. and it always gives a pleasing painting. So his jacket is the focal point of this whole painting, so it'll be overall pretty cool, and then everything else will be hot. The jacket. I just need to get something else. What do we need? We'll have some rhomb. This is the subject is where is rhomb? Oh, it's 41. These are the paints, by the way. I have the full range. My favourite art shop in Bulgaria kept running out of them, so I just I took some action to make sure that I had enough paint to paint for the next 5 years. So rhomb is number 41, so we'll have a little blob of that, and it's the colour that I usually use, mixed with something else, probably a little bit of ultramarine, so I'll bob it in this dish, if I can get it open. I get a repetitive strain injury on these. So what? Here's a little tip. If the tube gets stuck, just swish it around in some water, and that usually does the trick. It's not going to this time, is it? That's typical. Okay, so we're going to use sepia. Is that a boob? Boob number 1. Make sure you have your paints prepared.
Matt's going for brew and the smoke. He'll be back.
I might join you actually, Matt. I've got a new Liberia, a 0%, just for Dutch courage, because we were so nervous. So I've just bobbed some sepia into here, or rhomb, and this is just for the shadows. Some of these rocks. The area here is actually sea defences, and it's those funny shaped concrete things. So I'm going to paint these wet on dry. So let's have a little bit of sepia mixed up. Don't need much of this. And I'm just going to paint these. This is the sea wall. So I'm going to paint this wet on dry, and I'm just leaving a little highlight at the top of this. This is again a lead in, as they call it, and this leads your eye into the painting. I'm leaving a few gaps in there of white paper, and I'm going to leave a small white area just there. I'm painting quite carefully around the boat. So this is the shadow side of this sea defence, so you're not going to get many highlights on this. Again, I'm just avoiding a lining up issue just there. Let's have a few little, call that Morse code, and can lift out a few highlights from that too, just with a slightly moist brush. Make sure there's not a bead like I just had. On this area of the land as well, if I can find a toothbrush, Sarah might be able to pass one out of my kit.
Mark Watercolours joined you as well.
Who?
Mark.
Oh yeah, hi. Yeah, I think you subscribed fairly recently, didn't you? Welcome. So we have a toothbrush. I'll show you what I'm going to do with that later. So now I'm going to add some of my shadow colour to this wet wash, just with a rigger. And I just want some variety in that colour. I don't like to use single colours on their own. The important thing here is to paint around the boat very carefully. A bit on there. And on this side, because it's further away, I'm going to switch to a combination of that brown and a little bit of caput mortuum. Again, avoiding a lining up issue. And these are those funny defensive concrete things. And I'm just leaving a little bit of texture on there. I'll add some caput mortuum to the bottom of it, and let that bleed on the paper. Again, taking care around the boat. Add a touch of that over there. I'm going to leave that little white gap just there. Again, there could be a lining up issue if I didn't go above this horizon line. So I'll just add some shadow to these concrete blocks. We'll add some other shapes down here. And then this area is a man-made thing, and this is where the entrance to the harbour is. So there's a light on the top of this, but we're not going to make much of that. So again, light's coming from the right hand side, so I'm just going to paint the left hand side of this construction. And this has actually got doors in it. This is the top of the light. It's got kind of arches in there, I think. But I'm going to leave the right hand side of that structure just with unpainted paper. And you can see now that you don't have to paint the light side. All you do is paint the shadow side. The light side paints itself, because we're going to reverse paint around that when it comes to doing this next hill. So I'm going to try and make sure, I'm going to try and make sure that this is dry before I actually come down to it, but I don't know if that's going to be possible, but we'll give it a whirl anyway. There also might be some reflections from this down in the water, and I wouldn't normally do this till this was bone dry. It's still a little bit damp, so we may end up with a cauliflower. But I'm going to paint this wet into wet, and I want this reflection in the water. So it's just a vertical sweep, just with water, and hope that we don't get a cauliflower. We'll use caput mortuum, and then just tip your board up and let the reflection do its own work. Can you see that?
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm just taking the moisture out of the brush and just sweep it down. And then just to make it convincing, just take the same moist brush, take the moisture out of it, and then just give some sweeps like this. And that breaks up that colour, so it looks like...
Come a close up for detail.
Sorry?
Come a close up for detail.
Yeah. Can you zoom? Do you know how to zoom? Oh, do you want me to hold it
Yeah,
up?
it'd be easy for you.
There is a zoom on the camera, Sarah.
Just hold it steady.
Is it focusing on it?
Just on here, yeah.
So all I've done is I've swept in perfectly horizontal lines along the water. Okay. Can you see that? Okay. So now we've got the kind of background to Eftim the fisherman. Can you see that? Sorry, I have to have it on a slope because I'm left-handed. Okay, so this time I painted both these hills wet into wet. So this may be still slightly damp. We've got slightly buckled paper here. And usually what I would do is either have a cup of tea and a cigarette, like that's done, or I would get the hairdryer out and just dry that before I actually started with this hard edge. So now I'm mixing the caput mortuum even thicker. If you keep your test strips, you can actually compare the tones as well. This is the distant hill, this is the mid hill, and this one is the nearest hill. I don't know if you can see that. So that's quite a lot stronger than these two. And obviously they painted wet onto wet, so it made them even weaker. You can see if you compare that to these hills. So this is a bit too dark, so I'm going to add a little bit of water to that. I don't want it as dark as that, but as light as the middle one. And the best way to do this is to make sure that whenever you prepare paint, always make sure that you have enough paint. It's always better to mix too much, because you're against this drying time, the golden time, than have to mix the same colour again very quickly. There's nothing worse than that. So now I'm taking a smaller round brush and I'm going to paint this hillside. I'm going to leave that area just there because that's the mist from that one. And again, I'm just being careful with around the jacket of the fisherman. These are trees. Now at school we're actually taught, when you paint something, to paint a, let's do an example on here, a shape like this. You do the outline first and then you fill it in. But sometimes if you're doing a big area, if you did this first, by the time you get to fill the area in, this line will have dried and it'll always show. So I always say that it's always better to actually paint, and I'm left-handed again, so I paint in a direction that goes kind of like that. So if you're right-handed, you do it like that. Like a number 3. Oops, I've just blobbed on my painting. That's that one on the back. Right, we've got to make that into something. Right, we're ready for this. A slightly moist brush. If you work quickly, you can correct errors in watercolour. Now it's lifting off the hollows, and that'll do for. Sometimes the object comes before the reflection, so what I might do is put something else just up here, and then it'll look like the reflection. I knew this was all going to go wrong. It's because I waffle on. Okay, so into our caput mortuum, and I'm just painting gradually around this. I'm painting around Eftim's arm. He goes out here, he's a restaurant owner. His daughter said I was making him famous today. Being careful that that line's not too straight, because this is trees. I think I will have some trees just in there, otherwise it'll look unnatural with the end to it. So I'm keeping it wet. I'm trying to keep this edge just wet down here. So I'm going to moisten my brush a bit more. How are we doing online, Sarah?
Yeah, just keep moving it. It gets better if you keep moving up towards the camera and down again, just so people can see. You get better.
Okay, cool. Next week, Sarah's going to learn how to use the zoom. But it does get complicated. We were trying to keep this one as simple as we could. If you leave some small highlights on this hill, obviously this is the sunny side of this hill, so it could be that there might be some highlights on these trees. Again, carefully painting around the boat. And I'm trying to make it slightly lighter as I come down towards bottom. It's starting to dry up here, so I'm trying to keep this wet edge going. I'm going to do a little bit of lifting off on that area before I go too far, because I might not get the opportunity. Again, avoiding
someone else says,
lining up
Joe says, that didn't happen to just me when you blogged.
Do you know where it was? Where I did this little test strip, it was still wet and I laid it on my painting. Wally. Yeah, it was always going to be warts and all. But thanks for your support. Right, this is trees at the top here, so we can be quite jaggy with our brush strokes up there. Again, trying to keep that wet edge going. I'm going to avoid touching this area here if I can. And I'm trying to go for that misty effect on the bottom of this. If it bleeds, I'm sure I can even make that slightly weaker now. Again, the brush strokes are kind of coming down in the direction of the contours of the hill. And I'm trying to make this lighter as I get towards the bottom. That might cause a cauliflower, but hey ho, such is life. On the bottom of this, usually there's actually a village over here, and if you then go to a darker colour and just do what looks like Morse code, so you can add trees. Now we're getting into the middle distance, you might see some trees, so I'm just literally blobbing a little bit of caput mortuum onto there where it's still wet, and then you get what looks like trees. And on the bottom here it might be quite dark because the light's not getting into this area, so you can mix your paint quite strongly down there, and then if you just have kind of Morse code dots and dashes, it'll start to look like houses, a town. I'm going to keep that wet area going. I think, what is that town over there, Sarah? Chernomorets.
It's town by the sea.
Yeah. So you can see now that that starts to look like there's houses and things on that hillside.
Actually, it means Black Town.
Does it?
I think.
There you go then.
Sure,
Learn something new every day. I'm going to just paint one of those little windows there. Go a bit closer here. And quickly before this dries, you can actually do this at any stage, but I'm just going to dip the toothbrush into the dirty water. You can use it for dirty or clean, and then I'm emptying the surplus into my dish because we don't want a big blob, we want a fine spray. And now what I'm going to do is just flick into these hills, and then what happens is you end up with very small cauliflowers forming. I don't know if you can see that.
Just like that.
A bit lower, is that alright? And if you splash into any other areas, like I've just splashed water into the sky, just mop that up while it's still in that state. Okay, I think we're making progress. Okay, just did my finger into the paint.
What about your blob you did? Aren't you going to do a building or something?
Ah, no, it's okay, we'll get away with that. I'll show you how to correct mistakes, that's part of the joy. But when I was actually spreading this paint out, when it blobbed on there, it was actually only hitting the high bits of the paper, so I decided to leave it alone and come back to it when the paper has dried flat. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm leaving that, and I'm going to lift that off later.
Clean water.
Sorry?
Clean water.
Nah, it's fine. I'll only change my water. I sometimes change water 10 times throughout a painting. Green paint all over the place. Let me just wash my hands. Bear with me. Where the green paint from?
Tony Green said he's got to go, he's got visitors. So
bye, Tony.
Good luck.
Look, catch up with it online later. It gets added to my YouTube channel. Thanks for calling in. Bye. Okay. Now we need the dark side of the boat. So again, I'll use. Let's mix some burnt umber with ultramarine for this one. It's a nice neutral colour. We'll add some caput mortuum into that. If you can let me know if the lighting's alright. We did have some blinds open at the side and also the lights above, but it was casting a shadow on the painting itself, so we turned those off. So now I'm painting this wet on dry, and I'm going for the dark side of this ship. By the way, if you're painting old boats, there's a tip. We're there. Okay. Did you want something, Sarah? There's a tip when you're painting boats, and that's if you can draw a figure of 8, then you can draw a boat like these traditional boats, and you do it like this. And that would normally go down there. If you can draw that, then you can draw a boat, because then all you need to do is to flatten the bottom of it. And that's how you draw boats. So it's usually just a figure of 8. Depends on your perspective, of course. It might be a fatter number 8. Sarah's doing a good job of controlling things here. Thank you, darling. Okay, so now we're going for a real dark, and I'm painting this in the shape of the planks of this old boat, and I'm leaving that top edge because that's going to be illuminated by the water. Sorry, by the sun, not the water. Painting very carefully around these, what do they call them on the side of the boat?
Fenders.
We should know, shouldn't we, really?
Fenders.
Yeah, fenders. And then as I come to the bottom here, I'm actually going to make it darker, and that'll give weight to the bottom of the boat. So that's a kind of mid-tone colour. I'm painting real carefully into these little corners. And now I'm going to mix this paint even stronger. I'll need some tissue for this. I could do some more, sir, if you don't mind. Thanks. So I'm mixing caput mortuum into here, and I'm mixing this really strongly now. So this is really one of the strongest things in the painting. It's called counter change, when the darkest thing is against the lightest thing. I think that was a Ron Ransom. I'm going down to this water line where the boat meets the water, and I'm just going to add a real fine line down there of this red colour. Is anybody painting along with me today? So I'm just going to add some of this red just to the bottom of this boat, and we know from experience that this is the anti-fouling on the boat.
Hold up afterwards.
Sorry?
Hold up the camera afterwards.
Yeah. So I'm just added just a red line to the bottom of this. And now for the reflections. There's a couple of ways of doing this. This is the easiest. If you tip your board up, can you see that, Sarah? And then just with a slightly moist brush, just drag some of that dark colour down. And that's how you get the dark side of these reflections. I'm just going to add a little bit more paint to that. Obviously we need to re-establish that grounding line that we put on there. So the important thing about this is to make sure that that line is vertical. And then very quickly, I'll just wipe this off. Just take a slightly moist brush, the bigger the better, and we just want to try and break this line up. So all you do is just sweep that line to break it up, and then this looks like movement on the water. And then just quickly, while that's drying, I just want to mix a real thick caput mortuum again, and we'll just re-establish this line on the bottom. The red line's almost gone, but we can get that back later. Now there wouldn't be any light on this side of the boat, so I need to make sure that I paint that very carefully. I was trying not to touch that area behind that was wet. And there would be a dark line down here where the tiller is going into his hand, and there would also be dark on the inside of the front of the boat, which I think they call the bow, don't they, Sarah?
Yes.
The pointy bit.
Bow and stern.
That's it. So now we're going to paint this again carefully, reverse painting around here, and as the curve of this boat curves around, it might actually get lighter in there, so I'll wash my brush out. With the paint that's already on there, just literally moisten this and it starts to look lighter as you get further down. Excuse me, it's almost a one colour painting this. It won't be when I paint this jacket. And then this side of the boat would also be dark because it's away from the sunlight. But I'm leaving just a little edge along the top where the sun would be caught on that cabin.
Too close for getting.
So we're establishing the dark sides of this boat now. And also the inside of the cabin would be dark, but I'll leave a little bit of detail in there, so that's just here. Just leave a couple of little highlights there, and I'm painting around his arm. Now underneath the rail on the sunny side of the boat, there might be a cast shadow because the light's coming from the right. So again, if I'd started it just there, there would be a lining up issue, so I'm just moving up just slightly, and that avoids it. And this is a tip that I use whenever painting roofs. So if you paint a shadow line and then just with a moist brush just wet the bottom of it, you end up with a soft edge and it looks like a convincing shadow, like that. And also on this side of the boat, the only bits that might be in shadow are the planks of wood forming this boat. So with a quite a weak caput mortuum, I'm just painting these planks. It's just a shadow of the planks. The planks are going to remain white because it is actually a white boat. And as I get towards the bottom, just add a little bit of that red. It's the same red that I used in the sky. It's usually more kind of light red oxide colour, but it just happened to be here, so I've used it. We'll drag that down.
And show how that bit.
Yeah, and that's where we're at the moment.
Slightly this way.
Okay. Where?
That's perfect. That's fine.
Okay. You're doing a good job. I must get you a direct, Sarah. Come on, let's see a little face. She's enjoying this. Come on. Okay.
Camera shy.
Now I'm going to add some colour into this now. The boat is actually white with a blue stripe, so now I'm going to use ultramarine blue. Is it ultramarine? No, it's cobalt. This is ultramarine. I want it to be different from the sea colour. So I'm just mixing this quite strong now. Are we in camera there, Sarah? Okay.
That's better.
Okay, now I want to introduce some blue.
T. Jones painting with you.
Oh, that's nice.
Pat Keller's doing it later on the replay.
Oh, you make a better job than I am. So now I'm introducing some of this, but I'm really careful to make sure that I leave a bit of that white, because that's the highlight that's just been caught by the sun. So this is with a rigger. Generally speaking, the darkest paint, the thickest paint and the smallest brushes come right at the end of the painting. So I'm going to introduce a bit of blue onto here and also onto the tiller. Is everything's boat blue on the cabin, can you remember?
I believe so, yeah.
Yeah, we'll do that blue too.
Just do a close when it's finished.
Okay. A little bit of blue on there. I think there's a grab rail on the top of there, so we'll just indicate that, and also down the tiller, and we'll also drag that paint into the water, and that's a reflection of that.
Just do a close one.
Yeah. So that's where we're at the moment. Can you see that all right?
No. Go higher. No, as in towards me. There.
Okay. So that's where we're at the moment. So now I'm going to assume that the side of one of these fenders is darker than the other, so we'll just add a dark line to this side. We'll also put a rope over the back of the boat. We might put something there. It has row locks, and there's always kit in a boat.
Or fishing nets.
Yeah, fishing nets, that's the one. And now I'm just going to add the same blue onto these. Sometimes these old boats just have half a tyre cut in half, but we'll put them a really posh fender on. Excuse me. And we'll have some lettering on the boat. Sozopol it says, in Cyrillic. I'm going to strengthen this side of the cabin because it's the same tone as the other one, and I want it to be a little stronger. I shouldn't really do this until it's totally dry, but I can cheat. I'll have the dark side of this things on the top. There's a little dark just here. We'll strengthen the rudder, take it into the water. Now for FDIM. Let's have a look. Let's have a little bit of burnt umber, and I'm leaving a highlight just on the sunny side of his face. He's actually looking to the right. I was just checking what other people have been catching. And now I'm going to paint his jacket, the focal point of the painting. So I'm going to do this wet into wet. I should really use a smaller brush than this, but it will suffice. So it's going to be light on the right hand side and darker on the left. So I'm going to mix some a real bright colour. Let's have this, which I think is cad orange. You alright?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to just float that onto the bright side of his jacket. He has a very distinctive stance when he goes out to sea, does Efton. He clenches his hands behind his back and holds the tiller, which is a stance I know well, and it's very comfortable. I'm going to just wash my brush out and then just lift out a highlight off the sunny side of his jacket. And then with a rigger brush, just going to add a little bit of detail. So on the left hand side would be darker than on the right, so this is just caput mortuum. So I'll indicate a hood, shadow on his arm, on this side of his head. I'd quite like to keep the white of his hat.
Do it close again.
Sorry. So that's effed him. Are we alright there?
Yeah.
Okay. And now his hat is white, just with some blue on it. So I'll paint the back of his hat like a captain's hat. And that's it. That's effed him. And now for the all important reflection in the water of the man. Same colour. And what you've got to bear in mind is that the white is going to take up about the same amount of space on the reflections. So I'm just going to add a little bit of paint to this. This is wet on dry. Then I'm going to wash my brush out. This is weaker. Reflections are usually lighter. So I'm just going to add wet into it and a big sweep down vertically. And then a wet brush. You can see I've got some dry brush there. And then I'm just going to break that line up, just so it looks convincing. Are you getting a good view of that, Sarah? Is that alright? Okay. Is everybody enjoying it? Has anybody got any questions? How many people's on, Sarah?
5.
Ah, that's nice for my first one. Okay, I've lost the bottom of this, so I'm just going to get this grounding back. And you can see how that makes the boat sit in the water. And purists look away now because I may use some white paint. Assuming I can get it out of the pot. Just bear with me. I'll use some cheap paint, I think. Sorry. I don't know if you can get the top off now, Sarah. This is white. I usually use white gouache for this. I don't usually use I know purists don't like using white paint, but it always it's okay if you can't get it. I'll get it out of the tube. Any joy? Anybody any tips on how to open paint lids that are stuck? I usually soak them, but that one's been soaking and we still can't get it out. Have you done it?
That's what you get for being a masseur.
Well done. Sarah's a masseur. She's got very strong hands. Now, just a quick tip here. This is white gouache, and I usually use this right at the end of the painting, just for the highlights, and it doesn't make it a pure watercolour, but I'm a great one for breaking rules. Now for this, I always make sure that I have clean water, so I'm going to swap this water for some clean. Because these are the highlights in the painting. So, and also when I teach quite a lot during the summer, and if I use the pot, or I let my students use the pot, then it'll get contaminated if there's one bit of colour goes in there. So if I was to touch the orange and then go into there, it would turn this a kind of peachy colour. So just a tip, I always use the paint from the lid. And then if it does get contaminated, you've only wasted the amount of paint in the lid. So into the water. So let's have some highlights. So this is just with a rigger brush. So let's have another line established just there. This can be dry brush as well at this stage. Has Matt rejoined us, or is he still?
Yeah, I think so.
Is he still there? So the thing to look for when you're considering these highlights at the very end is where is the darkest thing in the painting that I can contrast with the lightest thing in the painting. So for instance, just there is against quite a dark background, so if I just add, that's too weak, just 1 second. Excuse me. Oh, thanks. We've been in the sun all summer and I've got a silly cough. So I might add some details on here just to break this up. I might add a few little suggestions of lines on the back of the boat. And also dry brush is nice to use with gouache. So I don't know if you can see those little highlights. So we're nearly there. Oops. So let's have some highlights on Eftim's shoulder. That paint's quite weak in now. I'm going to go straight for it from the pot. Shock horror. I'll have a little highlight on the peak of his cap. On his shoulder where the sun would be hitting it. And also let's have some movement from the boat. So there might be a bow wave created from his boat, just there. And also he's moving in this direction, so there may also be some highlights in the water following him.
Mark's still here and painting with you, so you're not on your own.
Matt's painting?
Mark, watercolour.
Alright, hi. How's yours going? There's I've made facilities, I think, although who knows how Facebook works these days, but I've made facilities for people to post their efforts of their paintings on there. So if you'd like to share them, that'd be nice. And then this area here, which was the, I think it's his light that he takes out.
David Green's online early. He said it sounds great, but the video's only about 25%, so it's...
Oh, is it a bit shaky? Okay, cool.
Play about that next time.
Okie doke. Thanks for that feedback. So if you've got a dark area and you highlight, this is the brush that I use for it. Can you see that alright, Sarah? Just move these dishes out of the way. And if you use a flat brush like this, you can see if you squeeze it between your fingers, so there's hardly any moisture in it, and then this is the flattest part of your hand, and then use this almost vertically and just work your way really gently. You can then lift out a highlight at the very end, and then all you need to do with that, the highlight's already painted, so just add some detail. I think he has a lamp up here, and this side of the post would be dark. Got some tape going around it as they do, and then we'll just add a little bit more highlight, shadow under his hat, maybe strengthen this on his coat, and we'll have a little bit of movement in here. And I think we're about there. Have I missed anything? Ignore that shadow down there. Let's show you how to lift that out. So this was the stain. So again, flat brush, squeeze the water out of it, and then just, I'm going to give myself a highlight there. If you just rub away, it eventually disappears. I think that's it. I think we're there. Maybe the odd bird in the sky. This could be white, or it might be. They always follow boats into into the harbour, rarely out, because they haven't caught any fish yet. A couple of birds and a signature. And that's it. I don't know how we're doing for time. That's about an hour and 20 minutes, I think. Thank you all for joining me. For those that see it live, thanks for joining me. Those that see it recorded, please feel free to subscribe and to leave any comments. And Sarah, if you could just pass me this, there's just a few little things that I'd like to. So thanks to Pat Kelly, was it? Yeah, for this one from the Isle of Man. The next one is same time, same place, next Sunday, and that's on Waves, Rocks and Spray, and that was suggested by Christian Wotherspoon. So from Sarah and I, just a couple of little things. If you could leave feedback about the sound and quality, and I know we've had a couple of comments on that, so we'll try and address those. Don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. If you want a copy of my free ebook, which is called Watercolours for Beginners, just send me an email to artstevo@gmail.com. You can also tell me what you want me to paint, but I don't do portraits, anything other than that. I also run with Sarah art and yoga holidays in Bulgaria throughout the summer season, and workshops out of season as well, and prices are really good if you come either early or late in the season. You can also check out my other online activities on Facebook. I've got several pages on there, including Paint Buddy, Watercolours for Beginners. You can also check out everything on my blog, which is www.artstevo.wordpress.com. I can run private online lessons using Skype or something similar. And if you've enjoyed this one, please feel free to donate if you feel that it's appropriate. You can either become a patron on Patreon, or you can make a one-off donation to my artstevo@gmail.com PayPal account. You can pay that in your local currency. Any contribution is greatly received. I've been giving my free ebook away now for about 7 years, and it's gone to thousands of people less fortunate, and I'm trying to write another one. So hopefully this lesson has helped you understand watercolor paint. You can see it's still buckled up, but I'll post the finished painting once it's dry on my Facebook pages, and I think that's about it. Thank you from us both for bearing with us, and if you catch this later, then hopefully you'll enjoy it, and just feel free to ask me any questions. So same time, same place, next Sunday at 10 AM GMT. Is that right? GMTV, I know this end.
GMT. Pat Kelly says she loves your pen and ink sketches, so maybe that's...
Oh, thanks. I'll add that to the list, actually. We've got, I think the first 6 are booked in now, and if you look on my Facebook page for, which one is it on? Live streams by Martin Stephenson, you'll find that there's a list there. There's a document that I created, and I'll be listing them, and I'll also post the sketches. But the pen and ink ones I'd love to do. I've actually just done a tutorial on them, but it's quite labour intensive, so there's no way that I could fit that into an hour and 20 minutes or an hour or whatever. So it's probably best if you watch the YouTube tutorial on that one, if you don't mind, Pat, because I don't think it would come out so well on a video because it's all very fine and very close. Besides which, I need my fingernails manicured. Thanks for being here, and see you next week. Bye for now, from Sarah and from I.
Bye, thanks for coming.
Thanks for coming to Bulgaria. Bye.